All right, hello. This will be my presentation on my museum fieldwork for AS1, and I decided to do my presentation on the Oceania Exhibition at the British Museum. And as a Pacific Islander, I've been to the Oceania exhibit many times since living here in London, and I'm excited to talk about a couple things. So, all right, first things first, just to jump in. The things I wanted to highlight in this presentation are the first two topics you mentioned about how cultures are represented through the selection and presentation of objects and artifacts, and how the verbal texts or the plaques next to the artifacts interact with the objects and construct a narrative. And so the things I'll be focusing on in this presentation will be about voice in those, especially in the written text, like who is speaking in these plaques. Second is word choice, and how the word choice they use is constructing a colonial innocence narrative. I'll get more into that later on in the presentation. And thirdly, as far as how they presenting these cultures, I'll be talking about how they present living cultures and how that's actually a positive thing. All right, so the first things first, who is speaking in voice? And I was reading these plaques, there's so many to choose from, so I just chose very distinct ones I thought kind of made a point. So as I read this plaque, I'll just highlight a couple things. So it talks about Solomon Islanders used to travel around the islands by canoe, trading local products and raiding their enemies. Europeans introduced Solomon Islanders to the world beyond their islands. In the mid-19th century, Europeans came to Solomon Islands to trade. From 1870s, they recruited islanders as migrant workers in plantations. And then it talks about nowadays they are workers for foreign and national businesses. So the question with this plaque is, who is speaking? It is definitely not a Solomon Islander. The voice and the voice who is speaking is from a Western colonizer perspective. It's not Solomon Islanders commenting on their own culture and artifacts. It is from a colonizer Western perspective and their experience with these people and these artifacts. The rest of the paragraph is completely talking about Solomon Islanders in their relation to Europeans as migrant workers, neglecting the blackbirding and slavery history that took place before 1870, and the idea that Europeans came to Solomon Islanders to trade, which is a very simplistic, very generous way to put how Europeans came to the islands, which, like many other places that have been colonized, was not just to trade. It was to conquer, it was to expand the empire, colonization, the whole shebang. But that word choice of trade is just, I think it's almost comical. And just the aspect of, like, why are they not talking about Solomon Islanders in their own context? They're only talking about it from a European context. Europeans' first impressions of Solomon Islanders. But they describe Solomon Islanders in what they offer Europeans, which was slave labor and migrant work. And pretty much they're only talking about Solomon Islanders in their relationship to the utility that they offer Europeans. Right? And that's just a whole thing in and of itself. And obviously using things like raiding their enemies, like why, they put, like, traveling around canoe, trading with local products, and raiding their enemies, as if those three things are completely coherent. It's just so out of the blue. The voice is from an outsider's perspective. It's like coming to London and only focusing on, like, the knife crimes, the homelessness, and all these different things, instead of focusing on, like, what a Londoner thinks of London, you know. It's very much from an edict perspective, of outsider's perspective. Also, in a matter of voice, who is speaking, the voice is very much like a white savior complex, a white savior voice. In the previous plaque, it said, Europeans introduced Solomon Islanders to the world beyond their islands. And in this plaque right here, it says, Solomon Islanders' lives were transformed during the 20th century as they reluctantly accepted British colonial rule. So this creates this narrative that, like, it's like history started once Europeans came to Solomon Islands, and that's a very typical thing that happens in colonial narratives, right? That like history starts as soon as a white person touches the sand, which is so not true. Like, especially Solomon Islands is a very ancient, very a culture that's thousands and thousands of years old, but they don't mention that. They only mention it from a European's perspective. And so who is speaking? It is colonizers. It's a Western perspective, and it's very much like we changed their lives. And what I find ironic as a Pacific Islander is, especially when it comes to transforming their lives or expanding the world beyond their islands, like Pacific Islanders were as ancient a culture as Egyptians. Like when the Egyptian Empire started, Pacific Islanders were in Polynesia, which means that we were already in Melanesia. We're an ancient culture. We're ancient people, right, that have spread across different islands, and we are the best sailors in the world. We found every inhabitable Pacific island, and we mastered navigation, mastered wayfinding, mastered sailing, and especially finding an island in the Pacific Ocean, which is a third of the world's surface. It's like finding a needle in a haystack. We mastered that skill, and we found every island in the Pacific back when Europeans thought the American continent was India. So like the idea that, oh, Europeans expanded their world. It's like, we have already discovered a third of this world, so it's just so ironic. Just the narrative is very much like a white savior and whatnot. Anyway, to move on. There's this quote from Hames and Blumart from class that I thought was applicable to this. And when it talks about voice, and it says, problems of voice are problems of inequality. And as such, they will occur in every environment where inequality is a feature of the structure. And I wanted to talk about that in the context of the British Museum because, I don't need to tell you, British Museum has a very complicated, very not so nice history and its relationship to colonization. And so it surprised me at first when I went to the Oceania exhibit that these plaques were so European-centric, so white savior-centric, or white savior in voice. And it makes sense, though, because the British Museum itself is a structure. It's a structure of inequality. It's not people from these cultures commenting. It's about Western voices commenting on these cultures. All right, to continue on. So the second thing is word choice, and I call it constructing a colonial innocence narrative. Just in their word choice, like, for example, in this text plaque, it talks about Commodore Richard Powell seeing this Moai statue, the Hoa Hakananaya, and what he said is Commodore Richard Powell decided to bring him to Britain. And I'm just like, the word choice is astounding, because I'm like, decided to bring. It's like saying the thief on the street decided to bring their wallet back to their house. Bring your wallet back to their house. Like, that is theft, And even things like, right, decided, bring. And then it talks about, like, oh, we generously donated the Moai, or the people, or the sailors, someone donated the Moai statue to the British Museum. Like, donated, there is a whole lot of history in that they are not addressing. The donated, how is anything donated to the British Museum? It's just it's so complicated, and they're constructing this narrative where no one takes ownership, right? The British Museum doesn't take ownership. The colonizers don't take ownership. No one takes ownership. We're all it just happened. And so it's kind of like this narrative of, like, innocence, right? Like, instead of addressing the complexity of these things. And as far as addressing the complexity, it says they use very ominous promises of continued discussions with Rapa Nuians who requested this Moai statue. It's a very sacred Moai statue. They requested it back in 2018. And it says, almost to portray themselves as innocent and the good guy, our discussions are continuing. And so it's very ominous, it's very ambiguous, and doesn't address the complexity of it. All right, I think it's only fair that I talk about a positive thing that I thought was good in the British Museum, and it's this video that I saw in the Kitibes section. And so in the Kitibes section, there's this video, and right next to it is all the artifacts from Kitibes. But one thing I thought was very good as far as presenting this culture and these artifacts is that it wasn't just the artifacts. They put this video in there And obviously you can see the video is of live people performing a Kitibis dance. And I'm like, what this does is it shows you that this culture is not dead. It's not ancient Greece. It's not ancient Egypt, where the culture and everything is dead and the people are dead. It's like, no, Kitibis culture is alive. It's well. This is a living, breathing culture that continues to live on. And so I thought that was very crucial, because if I didn't know anything about Kitibis, I would think, oh, ancient people used to live in Kitibis and now it's abandoned or something. But no, this is a really good narrative, I think. They also did this with the Maori section. They had pictures that were fairly modern, fairly recent, and I thought that was very good in portraying living cultures. It's today, it's modern. These ancient beliefs are still being respected and believed in and valued by the people today, which I thought was very good. And that is my presentation on Oceania Exhibit. Lots to dissect. I enjoyed my time. Thank you so much for listening.